Welcome to Heritage Heroes, the first of 6 programs featuring the people on the front line of saving our urban legacy. Wars and the passage of time have probably done less damage to the monuments and historic hearts of our towns than modern development. Our series is about the individuals from all walks of life who share a conviction that there is room for the past in our rapidly expanding cities. Many historic buildings, open spaces and traditional neighbourhoods owe their survival to the determination of a handful of people. These individuals are our heroes, chosen by an independent jury of urban heritage experts. In the shadow of Sydney's famous Harbour Bridge, the area known as the Rocks was once on the verge of being levelled for office blocks. Our first heritage hero and a prime mover in the struggle to save the area is trade unionist Jack Mundy. In 1788, the first European settlers, mostly transported convicts from Britain, built their camp on this site. The buildings were made from local sandstone. That's how the Rocks got its name. Already by the 1900s, the buildings in this working-class area were decaying. By the 1960s and 70s, Sydney was undergoing a building boom. The Rocks' position in the city centre made it prime real estate for the developers. Their demolition seemed inevitable. Salvation came from an unlikely quarter.
When they decided to knock down a building just around here, they decided to knock down a building. Over 1,000 builders' labourers stopped up there working on those huge high-rise buildings, and they came down here en masse and occupied the building that was being knocked down by non-union labour, by scab labour. And so we stopped all of Sydney. Myself and other leaders got arrested, photographed my being carried away. That was a turning point. The battle for the Rocks in October '73 was a turning point for heritage in this country.
Today, most of the old houses are still homes. Some retain their original mid-19th century interiors. The Rocks attract 1 million visitors a year, keen to experience a fragment of the colonial inheritance. Mundy and his union members took on the developers behind, in today's money, a $2 billion plan to flatten the Rocks. Meredith Bergman was a student at the time.
The Sydney Morning Herald, the main Sydney paper, did 5 editorials in 14 days calling on the leadership of the builders' labourers to be jailed for treason was one. There were arrests, there were hundreds of arrests, and it really was about trying to save the soul of Sydney.
Opposition to the development scheme began when the residents of the Rocks turned to the Builders' Union for support in protecting their property.
We were a left-wing organisation, socialists and communists and social democrats coming together to improve the conditions of the workers on the job. And after we've improved the conditions, we felt that what's the good of raising conditions, wages and conditions, if we live in cities devoid of parks and denuded of trees?
An unlikely coalition developed between the labourers, residents and the Australian National Trust.
This was, as far as I know, an almost unique and really important heritage movement. What happened, there was a combination of local people who cared about and were passionate about the place, the traditional heritage preservation community who knew why it mattered, but what really was the ingredient that made the mixture so important and explosive was the involvement of builders' labourers and the unions. Wish for a fountain, lost in the
Well, that was really the knockout point, that here you had people who rarely spoke to each other, and so you had, as I termed it, the enlightened middle class who were sort of toppy-nosed and conservative, linking up with rough-hewn builders' labourers together.
They started looking at the use of their own labour. What was their own labour being used for, and why should they pull down beautiful old historic buildings or desecrate wonderful parkland or natural bushland? And that was when the whole idea of the green bands arrived, and it was Jack's idea to call them green bands.
Trick of the light, turn off the tide.
The green bands were a new form of strike action for environment and heritage protection.
Before the green bands, there were no planning regulations really at all. If you owned a building, you could pull it down. And so with hot money coming into Sydney from America, they were tearing down old buildings, beautiful old historic buildings, and up were going these really terrible high-rise executive suites.
The saving of the rocks had benefits the campaigners of the time had barely considered.
Building construction is one of the biggest producers of waste. It uses something like 40% of the world's resources. If we were to use existing buildings, we would be making a huge contribution to the environment as well as creating great places to live.
With global warming and the fact that climate change is going to be the biggest political issue of the 21st century, well then how much more important is the whole question of concern for ecology, concern for the buildings we're building, and concern for the buildings we're keeping.
If it hadn't been for Jack Mundy and the builders' labourers, the rocks that you see today would have been completely different. There would have been a forest of skyscrapers, what Jack calls a concrete jungle, rising up over Sydney Harbour. And you would have lost some of Sydney's most distinctive buildings, one of its most special neighbourhoods, and a really important reminder of the earliest origins of the colony.
Coming up, in Bahrain, revitalising 6,000 years of history. And in Havana, Cuba, over 12,000 people turn out to restore the colonial inheritance.